Hello and good morning, everybody. Welcome. I'm joining you live from Southern California. I'm currently in San Clemente, and this is going to be a 1 hour or 45-minute introduction to philosophy and theory live stream video. I'm so glad that you're here, whether you're joining on Instagram, hello Instagram, or YouTube below. This is an ongoing live stream lecture series that I've been hosting for the past 3 years now. Please do join from around the world. Drop a comment where you're joining me from. I see Cyprus, I see London. Hello, lovely that you're here. I see Croatia. Hello. It is early morning here in Southern California. Um, we're staying right by the beach, which is quite wonderful. And today we're going to have a session which I'm going to call Michelangelo's Trick, which is going to be starting with an anecdote, historical anecdote about Michelangelo's painting and art, but which I'm going to try to use to illustrate certain points about Slavoj Žižek's argument that we have to repeat Hegel, as well as the relationship between the Freudian drive and the Lacanian desire, and a whole bunch more of other ideas that I'm going to try to cover here today. I see Akron, is that Ohio? I see Brooklyn, India, the Netherlands, Istanbul, Merhaba. Yeah, so basically that's what we're going to do here for the next 45 minutes or so. A huge thank you, as per usual, to the patrons who continue to make these independently taught lectures possible in the first place. Thank you. And if you'd like to download my ebook, which accompanies these lectures, you can find that on my Patreon, exclusively for patrons. In fact, the ebook functions as a subscription service. So basically every 3 months, when I complete one of these lecture series, you can download the accompanying ebook that goes along with the lectures. So the current ebook right now is called The Night of the World, which is a basic primer on the Hegelian concept of the night of the world. You can find that and more, including all of the audio for hundreds of lectures that I've recorded on my Patreon. I'll put the link in bio, or you can go to www.patreon.com/JulianPhilosophy. I apologize for the poor lighting, lack of lighting. It's a little bit dark here. I'm just using a small desk lamp. But I am recording this for the first time, so this is an experiment. I'm going to try to record this lecture on a proper microphone so that hopefully the patrons will enjoy better audio quality, as well as those of you watching on YouTube. So please do let me know if the audio quality is improved or if you'd like me to adjust the microphone. Thank you to Jenlene, our producer, who has hooked me up to this mic today. I probably shouldn't touch it. Okay, so I want to start with a historical anecdote about. Oh, move it to your collar, someone says, the mic. Okay, let's try that. And then we'll begin. Let's see. Collar. See if that works. Apologies if this is creating all manner of distortion. All right, that looks a bit weird, but okay, sure. Let's see if that works. Okay, so I'm going to start the lecture right now. Make yourself comfortable. I'm going to be here for about 45 minutes. If you'd like to learn a little bit about art and philosophy and psychoanalytic theory, then you've come to the right place. So there's a historical anecdote about Michelangelo, which, as is usual with these stories, we can't really verify. But the story goes like this. One day, Michelangelo was working on the Sixtine Chapel, and a group of spectators comes in to look how the work is going. And they become convinced that one part of the chapel is wrong, that, he hasn't gotten it right, that from the perspective of being up there, it looks good, but from down below, it looks totally wrong. And so they lodge a complaint. And Michelangelo says, okay, I'll see what I can do. And a month goes by, and Michelangelo does nothing. He basically doesn't make a single change. And then the inspectors come back, and they look at it, and they marvel. They say, wow, it looks so amazing. It looks so good. How were you able to completely change it? And Michelangelo says, well, that's my secret. And so Michelangelo's trick, or Michelangelo's secret, as it were, is precisely that there is no secret. That fundamentally he hasn't changed the painting. And yet, nevertheless, it appears, to all intents and purposes, from the perspective of the subjective viewers, that he has fixed it, that he has done something to alter it, to make it better, as it were. Of course, the simple interpretation of this story is simply to say, well, the viewers were wrong. They didn't know what they were seeing. What they wanted was to have a minute change. It's a little bit like how at a lot of fancy steak restaurants in the United States, people will send their steak back almost as part of the dinner theater because it's not perfectly cooked to their liking. And oftentimes, I suspect, at least I was reading about this from a New York Times reviewer, the chefs will take, the waiters will take the steak back to the kitchen, and they'll keep it in the kitchen, keep it warm, and then they'll bring it back to the table, having changed nothing. And usually the diners will be very happy, because to all intents and purposes, now the steak is the way they wanted it. Now, it's not about determining whether the diners were in fact wrong or the chef is manipulating the diners. It's that, strictly speaking, and hear me out, this is quite important, strictly speaking, the steak has changed. It is a different steak because it has been sent back to the kitchen and now has undergone the theater or the ritual of the subjective investment of the diner who said, I would like you to cook the steak again. Something similar happens with Michelangelo's trick. Oh, is the volume low? I'm so sorry. Someone says the volume is low. If you can't hear me on YouTube, please do let me know. And it might be that there's a connection lag. I'm sorry. And otherwise, you can also watch on Instagram. I apologize for the poor connection. I'm currently making do with the connection I have here. And so what happens is, strictly speaking, whether it's the steak that got sent back to the chef, whether it's the painting that wasn't changed, it's a little low. Okay, let's see if we can... Is it better if I hold it up like this? Let's see if I hold up the mic like this. That might be better. Thank you, everybody, for your patience. This is the very first time that I'm shooting with this lovely mic, and I really do hope that it makes a difference for people on YouTube. Thank you, Instagram, for letting me know that the sound is good. Okay, so I'm going to briefly recap. We have two anecdotes. The first anecdote is a historical one about Michelangelo working on the beautiful paintings of the ceiling of the Sixtine Chapel. And a group of spectators come in and they say, it's not right. And so for a month or so, Michelangelo pretends to be fixing it, pretends to be working on the ceiling. But then really he does nothing. And yet when the spectators come back, they're amazed how much better it is. They're so happy at all the changes Michelangelo has made. And so the trick that Michelangelo has done is that he's basically done nothing. He's simply pretended to have changed it. And the same thing happens, the same thing is true in certain restaurants, at least hearsay has it, that when you send a steak back, the chef will simply keep it warm and then send it back to you, having changed virtually nothing, and yet the diner is happy. Now, the diner hasn't been tricked in this situation. What has happened is that the diner has become subjectively involved in the theater of cuisine, as it were. In the same way that in Michelangelo's painting, what has happened is that the critic, the spectator, the person who goes in to judge the painting, has become subjectively involved in the process of the painting. And perhaps this was the point all along, that it wasn't about changing the painting in as much as it wasn't about changing the steak, but it was about including the subject in the creative process. Now, I would like to make a leap from these historical anecdotes towards the relationship between Kantian transcendentalism and Hegelian idealism. Kantian transcendentalism is essentially like what happens, the relationship between Kant and Hegel is essentially like what happens in the story of Michelangelo. Kant posits, and this may be familiar to you if you followed these classes before, Kant posits a non-traversable transcendental or ontological horizon. which is another way of saying that Kant says that we can't actually access capital T truth or essence or pure form, whatever name you'd like to give it. And Kant therefore argues that we can't access objects in themselves, the famous thing in itself, or in German, das Ding an sich. This means that, in a sense, we are forever desiring to find the thing in itself, and yet it's impossible. It's immutable. We are barred from it by our very reason. This is Kant's argument, as I've said before, that if something is supposed to be pure, then to conceptualize it through reason already makes it impure. Therefore, the very thought of it and the thought of wanting to think it is therefore already imminently the barrier to or from it, similar to what Kant would later call the antinomies. Now, this is a little bit like Kant walking in to the Sistine Chapel of philosophy and saying, it's wrong. It needs to be fixed. There's something I want that I can't have. I can't have the objects in themselves. And what Hegel does, what Hegel accomplishes, is therefore very similar to what Michelangelo does. Hegel doesn't fix metaphysics. Hegel doesn't say, I'm going to provide you with the thing in itself. Instead, strictly speaking, Hegel does nothing. Hegel continues to work around the problem, but he doesn't change the proposition. Instead, Hegel essentially goes back to the philosophical Kantian subject and says, here it is, I fixed it. And yet he hasn't so much overcome the problem or fixed the thing that the critic wanted. Let's recall that the Kantian transcendentalism is a critical transcendentalism in this sense. Instead, he simply transposed the problem into its own solution. In other words, he's repeated Kant without, strictly speaking, adding anything. Now, this might seem like a heresy to say, well, Hegel adds nothing to Kant, and yet it's a constitutive negativity. He adds precisely nothing, which is to say that Hegel transforms or transmutes or transposes, whichever word you find preferable, the gap between the subject and the ontological core of essence back into the subject himself. Now, it's quite technical, so I'll try to give you an example. Another famous historical anecdote relating to art. And apologies for those of you listening on the mic. I hope that me swallowing a sip of coffee doesn't sound horrible to you. There's a great historical anecdote about Picasso, who was working on his Guernica painting. And at a certain point, a member of the Gestapo comes into his atelier, and the Gestapo sees the painting of Guernica, which you may have seen before, which depicts the suffering and the slaughter committed in Guernica, which in many ways was a prelude and an experiment, a macabre foretaste, if you will, for what would occur during World War II. And the Gestapo looks at the painting, and he says to Picasso, "Did you do this?" And you may guess where this anecdote is going. Picasso then turns around to the Gestapo and says, "No, sir, you did." Here again, we have a lovely inversion of what appears to be the subjective attribution of the painting, which is to say, either the painting is the idea or the creation of the painterly subject, i.e. the artist, or it's that the painting is the emanation of the historical situation, what Adorno would call a constellation, in which the painting becomes inevitable, and the artist therefore simply, to use a slightly new age term, channels the historical situation into and through art. Therefore, strictly speaking, the culprit of the painting is no longer the painter, but in fact the Gestapo, the one who has occasioned the necessity for the existence of the painting in the first place. Now, what's important here is that therefore the member of the Gestapo doesn't recognize himself in the painting. And it's not that he doesn't recognize that the painting is about him. He fails to recognize that the painting is him, that without him the painting wouldn't exist. And something similar can be said about the Lacanian theory of the gaze. Lacan in his Seminars 11 argues that the gaze is what makes the subject account for himself, or exist, if you will, in his gaze. Therefore, it's not so much that the subject gazes upon something, but that, if you will, it is the other way around, that the object of the gaze gazes back at the subject. Moreover, that the subject is himself or itself the creation or the material manifestation of the gaze. It's important to note that this is a quite radical inversion of the Sartrean idea of the gaze. Remember, for Sartre, the gaze is like the look. It's essentially how the subject creates the image of others in his gaze. This is also how you'll probably see the gaze interpreted when it comes to feminist theories of art, which is to say, we have the so-called male gaze that creates the image of woman in a highly sexualized manner and turns her body into a symbol and a figuration of certain allegorical motifs relating to desire, which, of course, in contemporary terms would be described as the commodification of the female body. After all, within the lens of capitalism, the way in which we symbolize or figurate the problem of desire is specifically through the lens of the commodity fetish. Therefore, the idea that the depiction of the female body is a fetish, or is, if you will, a commodification of the body, is an extension of what is the critique related to the Sartrean gaze, the creation of an object in the form of the gazer. In other words, what is depicted is overdetermined by the gaze. Lacan essentially inverts this to a degree, which is quite radical. Lacan posits, and I'm simplifying here, of course, Lacan posits that it's not so much that the subject gazes upon something, but more radically, that the something gazes upon the subject, that the subject encounters himself in his own gaze, that the subject doesn't exist a priori except mirrored back to himself by his gaze. In other words, strictly speaking, the subject sees himself seeing, but in reverse. The subject is being seen, and this is what he observes. This is very similar to some beautiful poems that Fernando Pessoa, the 20th century Portuguese poet, perhaps the greatest Portuguese poet, wrote, where he talked about the problem of immanent self, that, strictly speaking, he couldn't believe that he existed without reminding himself that others existed. Therefore, he was forced to play a persona for others to remind himself that he, in fact, was still there. This is, from Pessoa's perspective, an inversion, yet again an inversion, of the Shakespearean idea that the world is but a stage. Now, the world is but a stage is a very similar idea to the Sartrean gaze. Namely, we have an autonomous subject who can create a character, who can posit himself upon the neutral stage of social life. In other words, if the world is a stage, then you can play a role on it. But Pessoa inverts this problem and essentially argues that without the stage, there is no self. Therefore, there is only the stage. The stage is synonymous with the self. The illusion is, in fact, the thing which contains the truth about selfhood. In fact, more radically, that the very idea of authentic selfhood is the ultimate illusion. And so we can see here why Pessoa, the Portuguese poet, is more modernist than Shakespeare, in the same way that Lacan is much more structuralist than Sartre, in that the argument is that it's not so much that the a priori subject creates his environs or posits himself neutrally, either through his gaze or his social outward appearance, but that it is the other way around. That the gaze is what exposes the subject, in the same way that the socio-symbolic order, the theater, as it were, the Shakespearean stage of social life, is what retroactively creates the illusion of the authentic subject. And so in both cases, nothing really changes, and yet we have an inversion of the order, if you will. It's not that we lend primacy to the subject who sees X, it is that X casts its own gaze back upon the subject. It's a little bit And I don't want to dabble too much in Nietzsche here, but it's a little bit like Nietzsche's idea that when you gaze into the abyss gazes back at you. Except, strictly speaking, from a more modernist perspective, you don't gaze at the abyss. It's that the abyss was always already gazing at you, that you find yourself in the gaze of the abyss. That would actually be a pretty good title for this lecture, The Gaze of the Abyss. Maybe I'll have to change it to that. Okay, anyway, the point is here that when we're talking about the Lacanian gaze, Lacan actually uses in his Seminar 11 an artistic example for the gaze, which is Holbein's painting of the ambassadors, which I believe is still in the National Gallery in London. Uh, at least I saw it there a couple of years ago, and it was wonderful seeing a painting in person that I had read so much about, that had been so constitutive to the formation of my own ideas. And in fact, if you're listening to this, I would briefly interrupt myself to give you a little note or message of encouragement, which is it's totally fine, in fact, sometimes preferable, to read about art in art books. Of course, it's a privilege to be able to go to museums and galleries and see them for yourself. But for me, often, it's better to read about a painting in advance and to become interested in it, and then to see it in a gallery, instead of simply walking into a gallery blind, as it were, and being confronted by the sheer scale of art. This is, of course, again, an aside. This is, of course, also part of the institution of the museum. And a museum like the Louvre is supposed to overwhelm you with the sheer abundance of art that exists there as a sign of the high civilization of the French Republic, etc. And I think the same could be said from a critical perspective of the British Museum. It's a wonderful institution, but let us not forget that it also represents the accumulation of art objects from and throughout the British Empire. Which isn't to say that you shouldn't go to the museum, that you shouldn't appreciate these objects. It's that sometimes learning about them in advance or thinking about them, writing about them, can actually entice you to then want to go and see them. It's a little bit like how sometimes if you if you listen to a band and you really like their music, it's more rewarding to see a live show than if you go to a live show and you've never heard the songs before. That's my aside. So don't feel bad if you don't go to a museum. Go to a library, find art books, enjoy reading about them. That's much more accessible. Of course, plug, if you'd like to learn about art with me, I also have a free Substack. I haven't posted a lot recently, but I post art introductions and explainers, so anybody can learn about art in an easy and accessible way. You can find that on my Substack, which is julianphilosophy.substack.com. Anyway, let's get back to the lecture. I'm going to take a sip of coffee. I'll move the mic away. There we go. Hopefully that's okay. Keep in mind, this is the first time I'm using this mic ever, so I hope it's working out. So I want to talk about Lacan's painting, or not Lacan's painting, Lacan's analysis of the ambassadors, Holbein's The Ambassadors. The painting represents two wealthy individuals, world travelers and potentially explorers, who are demonstrating their worldly goods. They're dressed to the nines and they're showcasing various exotic commodities and their wealth. Nothing about this painting is particularly extraordinary. And yet, if you look at the middle of the painting, and I really do hope you Google it, it's called The Ambassadors by Holbein, there appears to be a stain running right through the painting, which is not in fact a stain, but an anamorphic illusion, which is a technical way of saying that what is depicted in the front of the painting is in fact a skull. And it's a skull that's totally out of proportion to the rest of the painting. It's really like someone graffitied a skull onto the painting. And yet when you stand in front of the painting, you can't really see the skull. It presents itself as a stain, as a flaw in the painting. It's only when you look at the painting from the wrong angle that you see it in the right way. In other words, strictly speaking, you have to look at the painting twice. You have to repeat the gesture of looking at the painting without actually doing anything different save changing your subjective vantage point, which means that objectively nothing about the painting changes, and yet your subjective stance on the painting will radically change. And so if you look at the painting from the wrong angle, you see it in the right way, which is to say that you see the skull. You see a big skull in the middle of the painting. It's memento mori, which is a old Stoic notion which translates back from the Latin into think of death. Although I have to say, and at risk of sounding horribly pretentious, I think the English translation, think to die or think upon death, it doesn't fully capture it. And from a personal perspective, I went to school, I went to high school in the Netherlands. So I took 6 years of Latin and 3 years of Greek, which means that I learned Latin in Dutch, essentially. And the reason I'm bringing this up, apart from the fact that it sounds horribly pretentious, is that the Dutch translation of memento mori is actually quite beautiful. It's gedenk te sterven, or without my American accent, gedenk te sterven, or something like this. And gedenk te sterven doesn't just mean think about death or think about dying, but it means dwell upon the thought of death, if you will, which is much more accurate and much more beautiful. Of course, the strict translation of memento mori is a reminder of death. Don't forget to think about death, essentially. But to dwell upon the thought of death, therefore, means to subjectively think about something which cannot be thought. It's what appears to be a simple Stoic maxim about how you should remind yourself that death is inevitable, that it unites us all, that you should therefore practice gratitude and humility in your life, Stoic maxims, all of which are true and yet nevertheless somewhat reductive. To think death is, strictly speaking, to think something which cannot be thought. It's an impossibility. The idea of the memento mori, therefore, rather than simply being a humbling gesture, is in fact a metaphysical proposition about the fact that death can only be thought. Death can only be conceptualized, but it cannot be properly known, save, of course, to undergo it and to therefore lose the subjective stance through which death would be conceived. And now we're all of a sudden back at the Kantian problematic, aren't we? Which is to say, essence or truth, pure form, is impossible to know because of the subjective positing of it as a concept. In other words, we can't know it in its pure form, because to know it in its pure form would be to be the antithesis to the conceptual reason. And so, in a weird way, the Kantian thing in itself contains within it a form of death, or the same problem of death, which is that death is unknowable to us, save as a conceptual phasismile of death, an idea of death, a concept of death. And yet, strictly speaking, without death, without finitude, the very notion of subjectivity would be completely different, would perhaps even fail to exist as we know it. And so the subject is therefore irreducibly bound or tied to this notion of that which it cannot fully access. In other words, it is overdetermined by it. Or to put it back in terms of the Lacanian gaze, it's not so much that I think death, or that you think of death. It's that death thinks of you. That you are the product of that which cannot be thought, which is death. Therefore, to think or conceive of death is an impossibility, which means that death presents itself as an immutable sublime problem, meaning, strictly speaking, that death, through your inability to conceptualize it, forces you to conceive of or conceptualize life. It's not that the subject neutrally gazes upon that which cannot be known, i.e. death. It's the other way around. It's death creates the subject. Ironically, we could therefore, and I'm being a little bit silly here, of course, but facetious, but there is a kind of transition here from nihilism to absurdism. The relationship between nihilism and absurdism functions in an analogous way, which is to say, nihilism says there is only the abyss, there is only pain and suffering, there is only death. And the absurd says, yes, But it's precisely because there is only pain and suffering, because there is only the abyss, because there is only impossibility, that everything becomes exciting and absurd. It's because there is no meaning that life takes on meaning. It's a sublime proposition in the strictly speaking Kantian sense. It's something which is its own constitutive negativity. It exists because it doesn't exist. It's the transition, and I can return to this later. It's the transition from a gap or a lack onto a whole which presents a constitutive negativity, not simply something which is missing. In other words, death is not simply that which cannot be conceptualized at the end of the tunnel. It's that death is a hole, an abyss, out of which comes the very process of the meaningful existence that we attribute to life. Now, I want to briefly return to the painting, to Holbein's painting of the ambassadors. So essentially, we have in the middle of the ambassadors a giant skull, an anamorphic illusion, a memento mori, as it were. And from the Lacanian perspective, his theory of the gaze is that what the skull does is that it radically subjectivizes the painting, which is a fancy way of saying that once you see the skull, you have to count yourself in to the painting. It's like before you were a neutral spectator looking at a pretty painting of two wealthy individuals. Now you see something that doesn't fit into the painting, which in fact will only fit into the painting if you stand and look at the painting from the wrong angle. Hence also why certain historical art theorists have argued that the painting would have hung above a circular staircase, so that while you were walking up the staircase, you would see the skull. However, strictly speaking, it doesn't matter whether or not you see the skull correctly. It's that the skull forces you to acknowledge that you are in the painting, as it were. That your subjective gaze is what to some extent constitutes the painting's accurate or inaccurate existence. Or to put it perhaps in a more structuralist language, you complete the painting. It's a little bit like the notion that Roland Barthes would develop in The Death of the Author, that the reader is not simply the recipient of the text. The reader is the fundamental person who creates the text through receiving it. It's like if you have a zipper has two tongues, and one of them is the writer and the other one is the reader. In the same way, for art, you have the artist and you have the spectator. And now if you follow this lecture, you can actually make a full circle going back to the anecdote about Picasso. And you can see that, therefore, the Gestapo, the member of the Gestapo who walks into Picasso's atelier and sees Guernica on the wall and says, "Did you do this?" And Picasso says to him, "No, you did." Therefore, he is both the spectator and the culprit. He is both the one who has given cause to the creation of the painting through the historical circumstance of his affiliations. But vice versa, he is also the one who is the neutral spectator of the painting, who therefore is supposed to recognize himself in the painting. This means that from the Lacanian perspective, what we see in the painting is ourselves. But strictly speaking, it is the painting which sees us. Like the slapstick Gothic noir image of the portrait with hollow eyes that follows us as we walk through the room. In the same way, the anamorphic stain, the memento mori in Holbein's The Ambassadors, follows us. Not because it neutrally looks at us. It's because it forces ourselves to look at ourselves looking at the painting. Therefore, there's, avant la lettre, a deeply modernist gesture to this painting, which is that it essentially problematizes the relationship of the spectator to the painting. Now, why is this interesting for Lacan? Well, for Lacan, once again, it goes back to the idea of the gaze. And remember, the way that I simplified it is that for Lacan, the gaze is not the subject looking at X, but it is in fact the creation of the subject in the gaze of the thing upon which he is looking. In other words, the subject is the retroactive effect of the perspective of the gaze itself. This is therefore an ontological proposition. As I've said many times before, what Slavoj Žižek does, and I'm not the first one to say this, I mean, he himself is explicit about this, What Slavoj Žižek does in his philosophy is to draw ontological inferences from Lacanian psychoanalysis and posit them back onto a rereading of Hegel. Now, if you look at the Lacanian theory of the gaze, the ontological proposition is as follows. It's not that we have a neutral subject who posits reality. It's instead that the positing of reality through the gaze is what retroactively constitutes the subject. In other words, the subject does not try to pierce behind the veil of illusions. It's that the veil of illusions is what creates the subject in its own mirror image. Now, if this sounds horribly abstract, which indeed it is, I'd like to direct you to another one of Lacan's analyses of antiquity and art, which for long-term listeners of this series you may already be familiar with, which is Lacan's analysis of the Parnassian veil. So the Parnassian veil is a story, a legend, in which we have a painterly competition between Zeuxis and Parrhasius. And the question is, who is the better painter? Now, the way in which this is supposed to be judged is in normative classical terms. In other words, who can paint the most photorealistic depiction of a still life of grapes. And so both painters get to work painting grapes. Now, Zeuxis paints grapes that are so realistic, so tantalizingly juicy, that even the birds come to peck at the canvas. Parrhasius, on the other hand, keeps his painting in his atelier. And Zeuxis comes to inspect the painting, believing that he, of course, has won the competition. And he sees Parrhasius' painting covered by a shroud or a veil. And he goes towards the painting and he tries to lift the veil. And then he realizes that the veil was in fact the painting, that the veil was an optical illusion, a trompe-l'oeil as it were, that Parrhasius had not painted the grapes. He had painted what was supposed to be a cover of the canvas of the grapes. Parrhasius is then declared the winner of this artistic competition. And what Lacan argues about Parrhasius is that Parrhasius essentially painted the truth of the grapes. Now, how would that work? Think about it from a metaphysical proposition. Remember, even Plato called art a copy of a copy. If every material object in the world is supposed to have an essence, an ua form, a pure form that exists in some metaphysical realm, then strictly speaking, to create a painting of something which is already a copy of an ideal essence is therefore a reduction, or if you will, a repetition. The material object in the world is a copy of the ideal form, and therefore to paint it would be to paint a further copy. At least this would be the argument from the traditional binary metaphysical position, which posits that ideal truth exists somewhere in the sky in some non-traversable horizon of essence, and that material objects therefore contain within them the truth, which cannot be depicted, i.e., in Kantian terms, it cannot be conceptualized. And so what Zeuxis does is therefore to simply paint the image of the grapes, but therefore going further down the transcendental ladder of truth. Now it is a copy of a copy. Parrhasius, on the other hand, with his Parnassian veil, paints the problem itself. In other words, instead of painting grapes, he paints that which is supposed to be the grape. Or let me put it differently. If the actual material grape is already the copy of the ideal, if the actual grape in the world is already the falsification of the ideal, the copy, as it were, then rather than painting a copy of the copy, in other words, another image of a grape, Parrhasius paints the essence of the grape. The grape is the veil. The grape is the veil which shrouds us from the ideal. In other words, in the same way in which Kant argues that objects present the unknowable things in themselves within them, and therefore the objects are themselves the barrier to this thing, Parasios paints the grape as what it really is, namely a barrier, as a veil. And yet the reason that Lacan is interested in this painting is precisely because it upends the traditional metaphysical binary. Instead of positing that there is something behind the veil of appearances, Parasios posits that the truth is synonymous with the veil of appearances. In other words, if actual physical grape in the world equals veil, then Parasios paints a literal veil, and the literal veil is therefore not the truth in the grape, but the truth of the grape. In other words, Parasios, avant la lettre, has made conceptual art, which is to say, he's not painted the content of the grape in its symbolic or figurative form. Instead, he has painted the form of the problem of the depiction of grape. In other words, Parasios has painted the veil, therefore revealing that the veil is not the barrier that prevents us from truth, but that the veil equals truth. In other words, to put it in terms of the sublime, that what appears to be the barrier to substance is in fact the truth of substance. What appears to be the formal opposition towards the ideal content is in fact the content of the form. Now, I can expand upon this in the seminar, which I record after the lecture if you're interested, which is for patrons. I record a seminar after every lecture for patrons, which I also post as an audio file. Now, the point here, to bind all this together, is that, as I said before, Zizek makes an ontological argument using Lacanian psychoanalysis, which he then brings back to Hegel. Hegel's ontology, in its simplest form, is that the fall retroactively generates that from which it is falling, which, if we put it in Kantian terms, is that the barrier to reason retroactively posits reason as such, or that the veil which obscures truth retroactively equals truth. Therefore, what appears at first glance to be the problem is in fact always already the solution. Except, what has to be changed, therefore, is not the ontological content of substance. What has to be changed is the subjective stance on substance. However, once again, strictly speaking, it's not that the subject has to make changes in the substance so as to see it properly. It's that as soon as the subject accounts for himself in substance, he already sees it for what it is. Therefore, Hegel, and I know this is difficult to grasp, and I apologize, and I'll return to it next week, what Hegel therefore performs is similar to what Michelangelo's trick is. Remember, when the spectators go into Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel and they say, "We want you to change it," he doesn't change anything. He simply invites them back in. And now they say, "It is changed, it is perfect." In other words, they have subjectively counted themselves into the painting. In the same way that the diner at the steak restaurant sends the steak back and the chef doesn't change anything, and the customer is happy once he gets the steak back 10 minutes later. The subject has been accounted for in the dining experience. Slavoj Žižek argues that Hegel does the same apropos Kant. That what happens with Hegel is that he doesn't solve or fix the Kantian problem. If we imagine Kant like a patron at a steak restaurant who sends back his metaphysical steak, Hegel, being the chef, doesn't change anything. He simply sends it back as it is, accounting for the subjective problem, the subjective insistence that it is impossibly wrong. Therefore, nothing has changed except for the repetition. And this is what is key. Hegel doesn't fix Kant. Hegel repeats Kant. Hegel repeats Kant in a way that fundamentally inverts the subjective stance on what appears to be the ontological problem. Remember, for Kant, reason is the barrier to truth. Reason is like the veil hiding truth. Hegel simply shows that there is no ontological core behind the veil save for the veil. There is no thing an sich, save for the concept of the thing an sich. Therefore, what appears at first to be the immutable, non-traversable horizon of ontological meaning, i.e., the hidden core of essence within objects, turns out to be not the problem but the solution. And the way in which Zizek talks about this is he says that we go here from desire to drive. In Lacanian terms, or Freudo-Lacanian terms, desire is that we want an object which completes us. In other words, I need X in order to be complete. From a Lacanian perspective, drive is when we don't want the object to complete us. Instead, we want to revolve around the object. It's a little bit like a fidget spinner. A fidget spinner has no beginning or end. The pleasure of the fidget spinner is pure drive. It's pure repetition. You simply keep on doing it. It's like twirling a pencil in your fingers. It's not for writing, it's for twirling. Therefore, the relationship to lack changes. From a Freudian perspective, desire is you lack something which you believe will make you complete. From a Lacanian perspective, drive occurs once the lacking becomes constitutive and therefore never ending and therein complete. This is why Zizek says that Kant is like the Freudian conception of desire. Kant believes that if we can access the realm of the things in themselves, that we will be complete, that everything will fit together. Hegel simply transmutes the problem from desire into drive. It is never complete. It is always ongoing. It is radically open, ontologically incomplete. Similar to Lacan's argument that the only universal is difference, the Hegelian position apropos Kant would be that the only purity is impurity. Substance equals subject. Substance equals subject. Hegel's famous, infamous aphorism that the two immutable poles of classical Platonic metaphysics, i.e., the ideal and the world of appearances, substance, pure form, subject, the world of concepts, are not immutably opposed. They are one. Therefore, Hegel's substance equals subject is the logic of drive. The logic by which the failure to be reunited or complete, the failure to access the thing which would fulfill our desire, becomes itself constitutive. In fact, what makes drive undead is precisely that it has no object which would complete it. Instead, it is loss as its own object. Drive revolves around a fundamental empty core, a hollow space which creates purpose, which creates necessity, or in Freudian terms, repetition, compulsion. And Zizek therefore argues that the Lacanian theory of drive, the undead core, exists in Hegel. Kant is the thinker of desire. The object of desire will complete me. Hegel is the thinker of drive, or in other terms, Hegel is the thinker of the objet petit a, or the object cause of desire. The transition is from the Freudian Kantian position, the object of desire, that which completes me, towards the Lacanian position of the object cause of desire, which is that there is no a priori object which could provide completion, save for the empty positing of a lack, which creates the circular, repetitive, undead drive of constant repetition. Therefore, when Zizek argues that we have to repeat Hegel, what he really means is that Hegel himself is already a repetition of Kant, except not a repetition as in I'm doing what Kant did, but as in a radical negative inversion, in the same way that drive is the constant, undead, if you will, repetition of the central logical principle of desire, in the same way Hegel posits the undead objet a, object cause motion of an ontological metaphysical system which no longer has an a priori content, in other words, no ideal substance, save for the impossibility of reaching, say, substance. And so, in the transition from Freudian desire to Lacanian drive, Zizek sees mirrored the transition from Kantian critical transcendentalism towards Hegelian idealism. Now, this is a lot, granted, for 50 minutes, but I've done my best to try to explain these things clearly whilst maintaining their complexity. And what I promise you is this. Next week, I will give you a more detailed explainer of the objet petit a and how it relates to drive. And I think if we could have a thumbnail for this video, it would probably be Hegel with a fidget spinner. And if there's one image I'd like you to end this lecture with, it's the idea of Hegel with a fidget spinner. A Hegel of drive, a Hegel of death drive. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you for listening. I'm so grateful that you're here today. I love starting my week in philosophical fashion with you. Oh, we've lost the connection on Instagram. We're back. I will be posting. We've lost the connection again. I'm so sorry. I'm glad it only happened. I will be posting the audio to Patreon. And on Patreon, you can also find the ebook version of my lectures. Thank you so much for joining me, and I will see you next week. Bye-bye.